Welcome to Module 3 of Politics 2683. In this module, we will discuss the concept of anarchy, or the absence of an overarching order in international relations, as well as ways in which international actors, such as the United Nations, try to bring order to global politics. In Module 3, we will learn about key concepts in international relations. In particular, we will look at human nature, anarchy, rational choice, structure, and agency debates. These concepts will allow us to understand the first theory of international relations that we cover in this class, realism, and its contemporary variant, neoliberalism, better. Then we will talk about realism and neorealism in relation to Cold War and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Let us take a moment to revisit a core concept we learned in the last module. As we discussed last module, Weber argues that sovereignty is the monopoly over legitimate use of violence over a given population in a given territory. It is a central concept in international relations. All the theories and concepts we will cover in this course interact with the concept of sovereignty, one way or another. Its power as a concept is visible in how it divides the world into national and international spheres, making domestic or national untouchable while rendering the international ungovernable or anarchic. Building on that understanding of sovereignty and the international realm as an anarchic realm, in this module, we will cover anarchy, human nature, rational choice, and structure and agency debate in international relations. As I mentioned before, in this module, we will cover four key concepts that are going to be central to the rest of the course. So first, we will cover the question of human nature, and we will talk about how the different understandings of human nature have informed different theories, classical theories of international relations. Then we're going to talk about the question of anarchy, which in this particular context refers to lack of an overarching government in international order, international relations. And then we'll talk about the question of choice, and in particular, an economic understanding of choice as a rational choice, looking at the cost-benefit analysis behind decisions that states make. And then we're going to talk about a particular debate that informs some of the theories that we're going to talk about in international relations. And that's the structure and agency debate, discussing questions of what or who has power over actions in international relations. Is it the individual agency of actors, or rather sort of a structural force like capitalism or democracy, or questions of anarchy that defines the available options to individual actors occupying the international domain? The word anarchy has an everyday meaning chaos, or we think of burning cars, or sort of people wearing black masks and whatnot, the sort of the stereotypical understanding of anarchy. But anarchy in the context of international relations has a very different meaning. In its everyday use, whereas the word refers to chaos and disorder, the meaning of the word in international relations is rather different. Anarchy's etymology derives from ancient Greek and enters into the English language through Latin. It means an entity without a chief or a ruler. So there's two words there. It's anarchia that enters anarchos. So an refers to without, and archos without chief or ruler. In international relations, if a scholar is saying that the international relations is anarchic, what they're saying is that there is no central authority, there is no world government, there is no global police force, that the international order lacks an overarching government, undermining prospects for cooperation and making conflict a possibility. This does not mean that international relations is disorderly or chaotic. Rather, it means that without a global government and a set of laws and law enforcement actors, it is not possible to develop a trust mechanism among states. So they naturally gravitate towards looking after their own interests and maximizing their own capabilities to be able to look after their own when needed. This pessimistic take on the effects of anarchy derives from existing literature and political theory on human nature. Many modern thinkers, including Rousseau, Locke, and Hobbes, have reflected on the human nature as an insight into understanding why humans cooperate or seek conflict. While certain international relations theories touch on human nature, to them it's not a question of whether or not human nature is good or bad. That's not the question. It is about how humans are self-interested and what that self-interest means for their actions. All the theories that we will cover in this course touch on how state behavior impacts prospects for cooperation or conflict. Those two concepts are the defining concept of this class. As such, self interest or rational behavior is taken as a guiding principle to understand how states behave the way that they behave under anarchy. Rational choice, like anarchy, does not necessarily refer to the way in which we use the word in everyday life. So we're not talking about rationality or rational behavior or sort of sensible behavior. Rather, we're referring to a way of modeling social and economic behavior. In particular, what we mean when we use the word rational behavior is a kind of behavior that maximizes one's gains in life, both in absolute terms but also in relative terms in relation to a cost benefit analysis as well as in relation to another actor. In other words, in international relations, we use the concept of rational choice of states to describe state behavior that looks after the national interests of states, regardless of the motivations, expectations, or ideal scenarios, or even questions of ethics and morality. So states under anarchy do what do that do what is best for them, do what is best for their interests. They try to maximize their gains and they try to make their situation, their particular situation, within any given context, better. Another two essential key concepts in international relations are structure and agency. These concepts are important to understand who acts in global politics, who can act and impact change in international politics. Structures, in this case, refers to recurrent arrangements that limit or shape choices and actions. A good example here would be capitalism or rules of laws. In particular, what I'm trying to explain here is structure limits the kinds of choices that are available to us. So just as rules and laws available or sort of limit what is available to us in terms of what we can do in a society, different rules and different laws limit what we cannot do. Different rules at school or different rules of this class limit an individual's choices. So you can only do the things that are allowed by the rules and laws. So structure operates similarly. Structure limits through different arrangements what states can or cannot do. Agency, on the other hand, refers to capability of making rational decisions, making, spending money, submitting essays, breaking the law, or committing different acts. For our purposes, let's think about the concept of anarchy. It is the structural reality of international relations according to some theories, like realism. It forces states to seek help. In other words, it forces states to be skeptical of each other. It determines the structure of interactions at the international level. Do states have a say in that? Do they still make decisions freely and without any limitations of their choice? Do every state have the same capabilities? Answering these questions obviously is not an easy task. This is why this issue remains debated among IR scholars. But let's think about it for a second. Does Canada and the United States have the same level of power in international relations? One may argue that because they're states, they do. But another would argue that no, in real terms, they don't, because the United States spends significantly more on their military, that they're significantly a more powerful country than us. So, if that is the case, what determines Canada's actions vis-a-vis the United States? Is it the question of anarchy? Is it the sort of our uncertainty towards American intentions, or is it sort of an understanding that we have trust over our relationship, that we believe in the United States, we trust in the United States, so we don't have to worry about the actions of the United States? What determines structure or agency here? Is it the power of the United States, or the sort of the uncertainty of the future, or is it sort of the everyday actions of the Canadian government? So thinking about that particular puzzle will inform the complexities of structure and agency debate. We will think about this puzzle in relation to all the theories that we cover in the class, and I will sort of, at the beginning or at the end of a lecture, would say that this was a structural theory or an agency-driven theory. So if we are to repeat, agency is the capacity of an agent, a person or another entity like a state, to act in a world. So states, NGOs, citizens, and individuals may have agency. They have the capacity to act independently to make their own free choices. Whereas structure refers to other factors such as social class, religion, gender, ethnicity, subculture, having money or not having money, having power or not having power, that seem to limit or influence the opportunities that individuals have. Anarchy, in this case, is a great example. Not knowing about the future, not having certainties about the future, might have an impact on the decisions or everyday actions of states. We will revisit these four concepts regularly in this class. They all serve a purpose in global politics, just as the theories we will be covering this module onwards. What is the purpose of international relations theories? Is it to make the world a more peaceful place? Is it to facilitate cooperation? Is it to help decision makers to make right choices? Is it to give guidance for security and survival in an uncertain world? Is it to explain world politics to a wider audience? So what we're going to talk about in the remainder of this module is the story of how realists consider to be survival in world politics. How do they see survival? What do states need to do to survive in world politics? Origins of realism dates back to ancient Greek historian Thucydides, who looked at the war in order to demonstrate how the logic of power politics, or the pursuit of power and interest, characterize interstate relations in conflict, rather than cooperation and action guided by moral principles. He argues that war is the central logic of international relations, rather than cooperation or morality. Similarly, Niccolo Machiavelli, an Italian thinker from the early modern era, advised future princes to break their promises when there is an interest to do so, and it is better to be feared than loved. As he argued, moral behavior is only possible under certain conditions of human existence. In other words, moral behavior is not possible, or even advisable, according to Machiavelli, in relations among states under anarchy. State leaders must seek out the best option for themselves and their people, regardless of their moral implications. Before we get into more detailed aspects of realism and neorealism, let's take a moment to understand the assumptions of realism. According to realists, states are central actors. They are driven by power, they are self-interested, or in other words, rational actors. For realists, international order is anarchic. In other words, there is no supranational authority above the state. State is the central actor. The aggressive intent of states, combined with anarchy, means that conflict is an ever-present reality in international relations. So questions of sovereignty, independence, and self-control define how realists understand international relations. To them, international organizations and international law are only effective if backed by force and sanctions and emerge to enforce the interests of the powerful states that develop them. So if we look at the contemporary international global order structured around organizations like the United Nations, realists would argue that the United Nations is only successful because of the fact that it represents a reflection of the current power distribution in the world. So the fact that the permanent members of the UN Security Council, which we will talk about in later weeks, have a veto is a reflection of how the world has been sort of shaped since the end of the Second World War. That those 5 countries are the countries that emerged victorious after the Second World War, and that they created a world system, a world governance system that reflects their own interests. Realists do not place much emphasis on the power of ideas in international relations, or in other words, they don't feel that the influential factor that defines international relations is ideas, that they believe that events are outcomes of power politics and different interests and aims. They're sort of a particular arrangement of material might. According to realists, they should be relatively silent on the rights of other states' citizens, and indeed should not be involved in intervention in domestic affairs of other states. So it is no surprise that realists would caution against military involvement of any kind, or any kind of intervention in civil wars like Syria, Bosnia, Ukraine, or demonstrations in Venezuela and elsewhere, unless it is in the direct interest of the state that is taking part in that intervention to do so. Realists obsess about power politics. They argue that power politics is the condition of life and survival under anarchy. States must try to maximize their power in order to survive. Yet, power politics is a costly and dangerous condition. Not everyone can survive it. In domestic affairs, sovereign entities emerge as legitimate actors because individuals gave up certain liberties, such as freedom to get whatever you want by force, for security. by subscribing to the power of a sovereign. This is called the social contract. This is the modern basis of the state system we discussed last module. But the problem we have in international politics is that scaling a social contract system up to the level of international relations is impossible without a global sovereign. Under anarchy, or the lack of a global sovereign, states fear the future. So they seek out ways in which to improve their power, investing in their military might, building alliances, developing nuclear weapons, among other activities. In this slide, you see the picture of the cover of Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. Uh, if we look at the painting, it's actually rather revealing because this iconic image offers multiple representations that provide the viewer with an access to many of the core themes of the Leviathan. At the bottom are juxtaposed competing or perhaps balancing sources of sovereign authority, images of ecclesiastical authority on the right and human or temporal authority on the left. In the grand center is the figure of the sovereign king, whose body is both literally and figuratively constituted by the blurring together of individual bodies of the citizenry, the co-signers of the social contract, who face away from the viewer and towards the sovereign, that they are looking towards the sovereign for his words. One discovers in this image the notion of sovereign authority as an artificial person built up of the consent of the multitude of natural persons. It illustrates Hobbes's theory that a multitude of men are made one person when they are by one man or one person represented, so that it be done with the consent of every one of that multitude in particular. According to the realist canon, states are the central actors of world politics. They are significantly more important than individuals, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, etc. They exercise power both internally and externally, obviously in different ways, but in such a way. The presence of states have important consequences for the role of different actors. Think about how individuals, companies, etc., behave as a result of the state's existence. We might argue that a corporation like Apple is a powerful being, but we also understand its limitations vis-a-vis the state. For realism, the essence of state's power is the ability to change behavior or dominate the structure. State power often takes the form of military or physical power. States are power or security maximizers. They try to maximize their power to maximize their security, a condition that is potentially lacking under anarchy. States seek to be power maximizing due to the uncertainties of the international realm, one that has no government or sovereign. The uncertainty of the future is a condition of anarchy that forces state to seek self-help. Self-help in this context refers to states' ability to develop capabilities that ensure their survival in case of an imminent threat without the help of others. States invest large amounts of military and develop mutually assured destruction capabilities with the development of nuclear weapons because they believe that those capabilities ensure their survival. State actions under anarchy may seem unethical or unmoral in some cases, but for realists, this is the way that the things are the way that they are because they ensure that states ensure their survival through these means. So according to realists, all is fair in war, as the objective of war is to win. Realist thinkers are interested in security of the state, as they see it as a condition of state survival, because according to realists, the existence of war is inevitable and ultimately unavoidable. So states need to provide their own security. They can't rely on others, so they have to rely on themselves. States can seek alliances with other states to ensure a balance of power in international relations so that no single state can come to dominate global politics. But they still, even within those within those alliance arrangements, they need to seek self-help. For realists, for that, obviously, military capabilities matter because they represent the bottom line. This question of self-reliance and self-help is nowhere clear as when we look at the question of nuclear stockpiles. So let's take a moment to look at the global nuclear stockpiles and how the end of the Cold War environment contributed to states developing more and more nuclear weapons. Clearly, since the Cold War, the states have lesser number of nuclear warheads, but they still have enough to destroy the human civilization a few times over. The realist understanding of world politics can be best explained through one of their core principles, realpolitik. This is a German term used to describe a particular interpretation of power politics, based primarily on power and on practical and material factors and considerations, rather than explicit ideological notions or moral or ethical premises. So, under realpolitik, states are asked to do what is necessary or possible, not what is ideal or desired. It is a particularly powerful combination of pragmatism, or doing what is necessary, and realism. Realpolitik argues that states may need to commit acts of necessary evil to ensure that their interests are looked after. Historically, we see this kind of idea of foreign policy emerge in proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, or Afghanistan, or CIA sponsoring military coups in Latin America, or sponsoring authoritarian regimes by the United States or Soviet Union during the Cold War and since then. That the states establish alliances and who they establish their alliances is not always as relevant as what those alliances do for their national interests. Nobody in the recent decades embodies realpolitik like the former State Secretary Henry Kissinger. Kissinger was born in Germany. He was a Jewish refugee who fled the Nazi regime with his family in 1938. He became the National Security Advisor in 1969 and later, concurrently, United States Secretary of State in 1973. He has been a proponent of realpolitik all his life. He played a prominent role in the United States foreign policy between 1969 and 1977. During this period, he pioneered the policy of détente with the Soviet Union, orchestrated the opening of relations with the People's Republic of China, and negotiated the Paris Peace Accords, ending the American involvement in the Vietnam War. Kissinger has also been associated with such controversial policies such as the CIA involvement in Chile and US support for Pakistan, despite the genocide during the Bangladesh War. Now, if we were to take a moment to recap classical liberalism, what we will see is that classical realism is all about power politics. States are central and motivated by national interest, driven by power. Realism, or classical realism, operates on a clear distinction between domestic and international relations. Classical realism is not only a way to understand state behavior, but when combined with realpolitik, it is actually a survival guide for the states in an uncertain world. Classical realism, however, is not without criticism. There are dedicated and passionate critics of this approach. These critics accuse realism of being too simplistic. They argue that the world is much more complex to be reduced to just simple power politics or realpolitik. They argue that we cannot assume that things will stay the same because they've always been this way. That's a logical fallacy. There's always the possibility of real change. Given globalization, states may no longer be the only actors in international relations. Realism also views the world from a very narrow ethnocentric perspective, in particular, Eurocentric perspective. Finally, it ignores the fact that states might have mutual or collective interests. Realism assumes that anarchy forces states to compete and not cooperate. We will cover what cooperation may look like in the next module. Now that we covered classical realism, let's start talking about the more contemporary iteration of that theory, neorealism. Neorealism is the brainchild of Kenneth Waltz, an American academic, who argued that the classical realism was too focused on the question of agency. He was adamant that the likelihood of conflict is not due to human nature, but rather due to the anarchic nature of international structure. So, in other words, he argued that it was anarchy that was causing the prospect of conflict and not rather the self-interested nature of human beings or states. Whereas classical realism bases analysis on human nature, and therefore subject to the ego and emotion of world leaders like Hitler, Stalin, Churchill, Trump, etc., neorealist thinkers instead propose that structural constraints such as anarchy determine state behavior. According to the neorealists, the international structure is defined by its ordering principle, anarchy, and the distribution of capabilities, measured by the number of great powers within the international system. So we can sort of look at the Cold War as a bipolar, sort of a two-power world system where there was a Soviet Union and the United States and its allies, And now we can see sort of the post Cold War era as a sort of a single superpower, the United States period, sort of between the 1989 to let's say maybe 2011, 2012. And then what we're seeing now is sort of the emergence of a particular sort of new post Cold War order where China is rising to be a superpower, Russia is re-emerging as a superpower, as well as sort of the United States maintaining status. Now, the question here is what ensures state survival? This is a question that neorealist asks over and over again in relation to the question of anarchy. There are different kinds of behavior a state can pursue under anarchy. Some neorealists believe in offensive strategies, arguing that states need to be proactive about reaching their interests, that they can't simply build their defensive capabilities hoping that would deter adversaries. They argue that states need to develop offensive capabilities in order to be better positioned in international power politics. Opposing this view are the defensive realists, who argue that states must limit their actions to developing defensive capabilities alone, arguing that pursuing offensive capabilities would result in an arms race and a less desirable future for all. A key difference between classical realism and neorealism is its approach to understanding of science and what a theory is. Whereas classical realism is a classical theory in that it's not sort of scientific, it relies on sort of interpretation of texts and sort of representations. Neorealism is a positivist theory. It argues that the social world is quantifiable and as a result can be explained through economic models. Whereas classical realism drew its understanding of world politics from history and discursive understanding of social relations, neorealism draws it from economic models and theoretical constructs. The model that we're talking about here is a specific scientific term. It refers to a theoretical construct that represents process through a set of variables. In particular, it presents an ideal process. This kind of IR theory requires a translation of empirical data into numerical data. The model should therefore represent a set of logical or quantitative relationships, causal or correlational. If we are to recap neorealism, neorealists argue that likelihood of conflict is not due to human nature, but rather due to the anarchic nature of international structure. So neorealist thinkers propose that structural constraints such as anarchy determines the state behavior. So for them, the core question is a twofold question. So what ensures state survival, and how do we know this to be the case? In answering the first question, they argue that there are different kinds of behavior a state can pursue under anarchy. Some neorealists believe in offensive strategies, arguing that states need to be proactive about reaching their interests. Opposing this view are the defensive realists, who argue that states must limit their actions to developing defensive capabilities, arguing that pursuing offensive capabilities would result in an arms race and a less desirable future for all. In answering the second question, they argue that we can now know more about state behavior under anarchy by looking at the empirical data that is translated into numerical data and operationalized through economic models of behavior. Now that we learned about realism and neorealism, let's look at an organization that came to define a period dominated by realpolitik, NATO and the Cold War. NATO is the acronym for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO constitutes a system of collective defense whereby its members agree to mutual defense in response to an attack by any external party. NATO members consist of some very powerful countries such as the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, which are also permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, with the power to veto any resolution coming off that body. And these countries are also officially nuclear weapon states. NATO headquarters are currently located in Haar in Brussels, Belgium, while the headquarters of the Allied Command's operation in Europe is near Mons, Belgium. The namesake treaty of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty, was signed in Washington on April 4, 1949. The date is important because it comes at the tail end of the Second World War and is perhaps a reaction to the Korean War. 12 nations originally signed the treaty and this became the founding members of NATO. Today, NATO consists of a total of 28 members. The North Atlantic Treaty has two articles that are worth mentioning. Article 4 is an important one. This one is about consultation. The parties, and the article goes like this, the parties will consult together whenever, in the opinion of any of them, the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of any of the parties is threatened. This is the first stage of a collective defense process. Article 4 ensures that NATO members will protect each other if a member state feels its territorial integrity, political independence, or security is under threat. Article 5 is a slightly more complex article, and I would encourage you to read the text that is on the slide. But it requires NATO members to defend a NATO member that was attacked militarily. This collective defense is the common principle of the common defense policy of the NATO, which is the backbone of the organization. In order to understand the significance of NATO, we must look at the history of the organization. The seeds of NATO were planted during the Korean War. It was at that time it became clear to Western powers that the world was going to be divided among two blocks. The Communist bloc consisting primarily of the Soviet Union, its allies, and later on China, and the Western powers that consisted primarily of the United States and its allies in Europe. NATO's mutual defense principle was all for one for all. This was designed to create a common identity among NATO allies. The implicit goal of NATO was to keep Soviets out, the Americans in, and Germans down in Europe. This is important to understand vis-a-vis the history of the Second World War. Because Europe was divided following the end of the Second World War, the United States' presence there was needed to ensure that the Soviet Union did not invade the whole continent. At the time, it's also important to remember that the United States was the only power with nuclear weapons. So NATO was a result of the overwhelming Russian military supremacy after the Second World War, and especially until the inclusion of West Germany in 1954 to NATO. Soviet Union had overwhelming troop supremacy in Europe. Whereas Allied nuclear advantage served as a deterrent until 1949, after the development of the Soviet bomb, the presence of nuclear bombs on both sides became the source of deterrence, under what is now known as the Mutually Assured Destruction or the MAD model. Let's take a moment to look at this picture. Cold War was precisely this, an arm wrestling match between the United States and the Soviet Union over the future of the world. Both sides were armed with nuclear weapons, and both sides saw the world as a chessboard, where they tried to inflict as much damage on each other as possible with the least amount of harm on themselves. Proxy wars, or wars that were supported by superpowers that did not officially involve them fighting each other, became the norm. So wars like Korea, Vietnam, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, among others, are brutal examples of such wars. The Cold War may seem like a historic relic to most of you that are taking this course right now, but it was an important part of the modern history of the world. Cold War was an era defined by diplomacy and realpolitik, whereas East versus West was the prominent paradigm to understand world politics at the time. The world was actually divided into three quote-unquote worlds, the first, second, and the third worlds. Even though today we refer to the third world as sort of the underdeveloped world, the term's origins actually refers to the unaligned movement, the countries that were not aligned with either the East or the West. During Cold War, there were no, once again, quote-unquote, big wars among superpowers, and only small proxy ones that did not directly include a superpower fighting against another one. This was achieved through the nuclear deterrence and the balance of power schemes that were embedded into the structure of Cold War. This map of Europe, divided along the lines of East versus West, Eastern Bloc countries are now represented in this map as red, and Western or NATO countries represented in blue shows a division in Europe in a very clear way. The end of the Cold War happened very rapidly, and not many observers predicted it. By mid-1980s, the Soviet economy was stagnant and faced sharp fall in foreign currency earnings as a result of the downward slide in oil prices in the 1980s. The new Soviet premier at the time, Gorbachev, introduced a set of economic and political reforms named Perestroika and Glasnost. Perestroika in Russia means restructuring, which started the transition away from planned communist economy to market economy, whereas Glasnost started the liberalization of the political life in the Soviet Union, giving citizens of the Soviet Union more rights and liberties, a dramatic shift away from previous authoritarian policies of the Soviet Union. Subsequently, the East versus West tensions rapidly subsided to the mid to late 1980s, culminating with the final summit in Moscow in 1989 when Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush signed the START I Arms Control Treaty, starting the process of nuclear arms reductions. In 1989, Soviet forces withdrew from Afghanistan, and by 1990, Gorbachev consented to German reunification. In 1991, following a failed coup attempt in the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War officially ended. Following the end of the Cold War, NATO kept expanding eastward to include former Soviet bloc countries. This map shows the enlargement of NATO and its expansion into former Soviet republics in Central and Eastern Europe following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991.
Let's take a moment to recapture what we learned in this module. Let's start with the core concepts we covered: anarchy, human nature, rational choice, and structure agency debate. In international relations, if a scholar is saying that the international relations is anarchic, what they mean is that there is no central authority, no world government, no police force, that the international order lacks an overarching government and undermining prospects for cooperation and making conflict a possibility in that order. This pessimistic take on the effects of anarchy derives from existing literature and political theory on human nature. While certain international relations theories touch on human nature, to them it is not a question of whether human nature is good or bad. It is about how humans are self-interested. Rational choice, like anarchy, does not necessarily refer to the way in which we understand or use the word rationality in everyday life. It refers to a way of modeling social or economic behavior. In particular, it understands rational behavior to mean a kind of behavior that maximizes one's gains in life, both in absolute terms, but also in relative terms in relation to cost-benefit analysis. Another two essential key concepts in IR are structure and agency. These concepts are important to understand who acts in global politics, who can act and impact change in international politics. Structure, in this case, refers to recurring arrangements that limit or shape choices or actions. So examples to this would be capitalism, anarchy, rules, constitutions, laws, etc. Agency, in return, refers to the capability of making rational decisions, spending money, submitting essays on time, obeying the rules, obeying the laws, etc. For our purposes, let's think about the concept of anarchy. It is a structural reality of international relations. It forces states to seek help. In other words, it forces states to be skeptical of each other. It determines the structure of interactions at the international level. We also introduced two theories of international relations in this module: classical realism, or realism, and neorealism. It is important to remember that realism is only a theory of international relations. It is not the theory. It is a rejection of idealism, of not about what ought to be, but about what it is. In essence, it emphasizes the importance of states, interest, and power. Whereas classical realism looked at human nature for influence, a self-interest driven concept, to understand why states behave the way that they do, neorealism looks at anarchy as a structural condition of international politics, arguing that states pursue offensive or defensive capabilities to ensure their survival. Realists, in this sense, argue that it is not possible to change the world. We just need to figure out a way to survive. If we look at the take-home points for the NATO and Cold War slides, we would come to the conclusion that the Cold War was a period that was primarily defined by the principle of realpolitik that combines realism and pragmatism. Both the West and Eastern camps tried to best each other through every possible means, often transcending ethical boundaries regularly in their involvement in proxy wars in places like Vietnam or Korea or in South America. NATO emerged as a solution to the Soviet supremacy in Europe. Combined with nuclear weapons, it served as a concrete deterrence to halt Soviet expansion. NATO and the Allies won the Cold War, but almost 30 years later, we have the Russian emergence and perhaps a new Cold War emerging between Russia and the United States. The weekly question for Module 3 is: discuss two core concepts, anarchy, human nature, rational choice, and structure and agency debate, and one theory, classical realism or neorealism, that we learned in this module to provide an insight into the creation of NATO during the Cold War by answering this question. Why did the United States and its allies felt the need to create a collective defensive agreement to counter Soviet threat? So what I'm asking for you to do in this is to sort of choose one of those four core debates or core concepts: anarchy, human nature, rational choice, or structure agency debate, and pick one theory that we learn in this module and answer that question by using those two concepts and that theory. Thank you very much.